Thank you, Steve, and thanks to all of you for coming out. And I want to say a few words first to those of you passing by who are wondering, what is this about and why should I care? For those of you who are Americans, whether you're from San Francisco or visiting from around the country, Julian Assange and Mumia Abu-jamal are being jailed and are being under threat of extradition in the case of Julian Assange, are being prosecuted in your name as Americans, and their prosecution is a threat to your freedom. For those of you who are visitors from around the world who've come here to San Francisco, welcome. But U.S. repression and the long arm of the U.S. assertion of long-arm jurisdiction is a threat to your freedom, too. My name's Edward Hasbrouk, as Steve said. I'm a member of the National Writers Union, which is an independent national union representing writers and digital media workers in every genre, medium, and business model. We are one of the U.S. affiliates of the International Federation of Journalists. And I bring you greetings today from Larry Goldbetter, president of the National Writers Union in New York. And from Brussels, I received the following statement this morning of solidarity from Dominique Pradalié, president of the International Federation of Journalists. For the past decade, the pursuit of Julian Assange has consumed me with fear, she writes, both for the WikiLeaks founder himself and for all the other journalists who would suffer were he convicted. Perhaps fresh legal instruments will present themselves to halt this process, but a much better solution would be for the U.S. government to realize the damage it is doing and to drop this prosecution. The impact of Assange being jailed in the U.S. would stifle the press at every latitude and at all points of the compass. His persecution has already made nervous those journalists who rely on classified material. Should his cell door clang shut for decades, any journalist handed sensitive documents would fret. Whatever the evidence of wrongdoing that had landed in their lap, is it worth the risk of publishing it? Assange's conviction would also endanger journalists whenever they travel to countries hostile to the U.S. Unsavory regimes will snatch and imprison reporters with impunity. When challenged, the despot's answer will be a shrug and a nod to the cell holding WikiLeaks founder. Perhaps Putin will never utter the words, "Hey, we all lock up the publishers of inconvenient truths," but that is what his smile will say. The case against Assange amounts to this. He sought out a confidential source who had significant evidence of what they considered to be criminal actions by the U.S. military, including shooting down civilians and journalists from a helicopter gunship. Assange is alleged to have coached this individual in discreetly removing this material and then passing it via WikiLeaks to publishers who would reveal serious criminal actions to the world. To me, it is obvious that these are actions routinely undertaken by investigative reporters. We would know much less about the war in Vietnam were it not for classified documents leaked by Daniel Ellsberg. Woodward and Bernstein's account of the Watergate break-in would have amounted to little without a confidential source. If the U.S. government does successfully prosecute an Australian who lives in the United Kingdom, then the punitive global reach of the U.S. Department of Justice will be cemented. Viewing this process from Europe, the case increasingly reminds me of a famous French injustice, that of Alfred Dreyfus. He was a French army officer wrongly convicted in an anti-Semitic conspiracy and imprisoned between 1894 and 1906. Today, no one doubts that Dreyfus was appallingly wronged by a reactionary establishment. At the turn of the 19th century, however, there was no more divisive issue in Europe. Scores of French institutions divided themselves into new organizations, split between the Dreyfusards and their opponents. Like many other victims of injustice, I'm certain that a time will come when the persecution of Assange will seem every bit as absurd as the case against Dreyfus or Nelson Mandela, or U.S. journalist Evan Gershkovich, currently wrongly being held in a Moscow jail. But that needn't happen, and I hope that it won't. But without a clamor that brings the U.S. government to its senses, we risk spending our next few decades wondering, why did we not speak up? Unless we find our voices to resist and raise our concerns wherever we can, a monstrous injustice to an individual is in process. as in a grievous blow to press freedom. On behalf of the 600,000 journalists around the world who are members of affiliates of the International Federation of Journalists I have the honor to represent, please do not let that happen. Signed, Dominique Pradalié, President, International Federation of Journalists. Let me say also, I was in, as Steve mentioned, I was in New York representing the NWU and IFJ inside the General Assembly chambers at UN headquarters in New York on World Press Freedom Day for an all-day symposium at which governments, good and bad, from around the world, and NGOs and others spoke out, attempting to create a soothing sense of common cause by all the world's governments in support of press freedom. I was the one who was there to raise the discomforting fact for the US representatives who wanted to talk about their support for press freedom elsewhere, that they are among the repressors of press freedom here at home. And I talked both about the case of Julian Assange, but also about Mumia Abu-jamal. And let me say a bit there about Mumia Abu-jamal. Mumia is an African-American radio journalist who has been imprisoned in Pennsylvania for more than 40 years on trumped-up charges, which were brought and trumped up as a retaliation for the effectiveness of his voice as a journalist on behalf of, in particular, African Americans in Philadelphia, victims of a racist fascist police force that terrorized their communities and whose voices had not previously been heard so widely or so effectively and so articulately as they were through Mumia. He was prosecuted, he was framed in an unsuccessful, I'm pleased to say, effort to silence his voice. Mumia is and has been for a long time a member of our union, the National Writers Union, holder of an International Federation of Journalists press pass. Earlier this year, our president, Larry Goldbetter, together with an international delegation from IFJ, visited Mumia in prison and was pleased to report that he's in better health than he had been at some points during the pandemic, and that he is carrying on with his journalistic work. One of the important things about the accusations made against both Julian Assange and Mumia Abu-jamal is the claim that these people aren't journalists. Well, the NWU is an extremely diverse union, the most diverse of American unions of writers and media workers, and I invite those of you here to join. Our effectiveness comes not because we have some highly paid staff, which we don't, but because by banding together, our members as volunteers are more able and more effective in advocating for our collective interests than those of all writers and media workers. But the NWU's membership, critically in this respect, includes journalists. The NWU is the only organization in the U.S. accredited by IFJ to vet and approve the credentials and the qualifications of freelance and self-published independent journalists to hold an IFJ press pass. We know something about who is and who isn't a journalist, and we say that Mumia is a journalist. Not just was a journalist, because here too there are people who will say Mumia was a journalist. Mumia is a journalist, and this is critical for us, for our union, the NWU, and for IFJ, and it's been an increasing part of our work in recent years. Journalism about impacted and oppressed communities is not just about people from the global north going to the global south to report on what's happening there. The fastest growth in IFJ's global membership has been among its members and affiliates from the global south, reporting not only to their own comrades in their countries, but reporting to the world more effectively than people parachuting in from the north could about what's going on. And in the same vein, while Mumia has continued, thanks to really important work that people on the outside have done to help facilitate getting his voice out, he has continued to provide commentary on the events on the outside world. He has also been a key voice in journalism from within the prisons. And as long as mass incarceration persists in this country, there is a community of millions of people caged in this country who are able and need to be able and empowered and assisted to carry out their own journalism, to report to each other and to us on what's happening inside these cages. And that journalism from within the cages has been an important part of Mumia's work, as signified perhaps most clearly by the title of one of his collections of commentaries, which was published under the title of Live from Death Row. Mumia is still alive. He is alive and off of death row only because of decades of activism. If he is to be free before he dies, it depends on continued activism. We in the NWU, we in the IFJ, stand with our brother, our comrade, our fellow journalist, Mumia Abu-Jamal, as we stand with Julian Assange. Free Mumia, free Assange, free them all. Thank you.